Do you want bass? Are you looking for that immense rumble? Well, apparently Audio-Technica has you covered. These guys make a lot of headphones, some long-time staples among professionals and many others that seem lost in the seas of headphone corpses. The ATH-WS1100is, rolls off the tongue, might be the latter of the two groups. This headphone costs around $200, sometimes less. Let's find out what it has to offer. Audio-Technica calls this their, quote, solid bass headphone. This was designed to work with portable devices such as cell phones, when phones had headphone jacks, hence the inline controls. Audio-Technica claims that the 1100 has highly accurate audio with a wide frequency response producing a rich textured bass sound. They say that the 1100 presents, quote, clear mid to high frequencies, and the air vents produce excellent bass reproduction. There's plenty of contradiction in Audio-Technica's marketing. Are these bassy headphones or accurate headphones? As with many marketing departments, this one is light on helpful information and heavy on audiophile jargon. Audio-Technica says that the 1100 is comfortable. Well, in order to achieve comfort, the company uses a very generous dose of plastic. The ear cups and yoke are plastic, though reasonably dense. The ear cups have a bit of metallic accent. The headband structure is metal. The earbuds are removable. Just peel them off and replace them with anything that fits. The headband and ear cup padding is of the same material, sponge-like foam. It is, however, soft. The ear cups swivel 180 degrees to lay flat. The headphones do not fold. Audio-Technica provides very little by way of accessories. You get one short cable with inline controls and a generic fake leather bag. The cable is on the cheap side, but transmits only very little microphonics, which in my book makes it a fantastic cable. As for comfort, well, this is going to be a split in opinion as usual. The ear cups are huge, spacious, and soft. They engulf my ears. But the headband clamp is fairly significant. It is tighter than the HD6XX. You can bend the headband a little to help adjust the tension, but then you lose the seal, which is part of the bass reproduction design. I can wear the 1100 for about 2 hours before needing a break. Overall, the 1100 has a muted, unpretentious design. It is well constructed but comes with paltry accessories. It has very comfortable ear pads but a tight clamp. Lots of give and take here. To test the 1100, I used it with a number of devices. This includes my RME 80i2 DAC, the Matrix Mini-i Pro 3, and the Low2 PAW 6000. I used the stock accessories. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. You do not need a powerful amp for this headphone. In fact, it works just fine with a dongle DAC such as the EcoZerta ITM03. Plugging the 1100 directly into my LG V30 required me to keep volume near the top end, but I was able to achieve volume sufficiently loud for me. Bass is the key feature of the 1100, at least where Audio-Technica's marketing is concerned. My tests indicate that this headphone has emphasized bass, particularly in the mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The 1100 presented this detail. The rumble was similar to what I heard on the neutral Audeze 4X. Transients was also similar. When the crescendo hit, the 1100 made the organ meld with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was emphasized and overwhelmed the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The 1100 presented this sound and some of the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the 1100 rendered them all similarly. In other words, the various drums all had hard impact, and each drum strike melded with the next. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the 1100 presented and emphasized the sub-bass. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the other end of a small room. The vocals were about 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were slightly louder than the sub-bass. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I use these tracks to determine if there is any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the 1100 has a bass emphasis. No surprise there, considering what Audio-Technica was promising, by the way. However, there is no better than average clarity in the bass region. My tests indicate that the 1100 has forward mids with sibilant vocals. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grade and sibilants mixed into the track. The 1100 presented both, but emphasized the sibilants. This was patently obvious when I compared the 1100 against the more neutral Aventone planar. The 1100 sibilants push was similar to what I heard on the AudioS4X, but it was, without doubt, far less than the HD560S. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The drums were louder than the other elements, but did not drown out the vocals. In Want You Back by Haim, the 1100 again showed that it emphasizes vocal sibilants. This was similar to what I heard on the LOS4X. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The 1100 rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The 1100 initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. However, when the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all melded. The drums were louder than the rest. The vocals remained 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the 1100 presented the ukulele, drums, and bass, but the drums were louder than the others. All instruments melded their notes together. The primary male vocalist was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was slightly emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The 1100 could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The 1100 presented this detail. Overall, the 1100 has forward mids. Both male and female artists receive a push in sibilants, though this is far from what the HD560S does. Despite the bass emphasis, vocals are clear and separate from bassy elements. My tests indicate that the 1100 has a marginal emphasis in the upper treble, but otherwise close to neutral treble rendition. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the 1100 presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, the higher pitched notes seemed a bit emphasized, louder than what I heard on the more neutral Aventone planar. On the other hand, this sounded similar to what I heard on the S4X, though maybe a little bit louder. The timpani was marginally emphasized, but it did not drown out the other instruments. The 1100 has some width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some sounded like they were deeper into the room, but no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the 1100 made the piano sound like it was 5 feet away. Its bassy notes were emphasized and each note melded with the next. The cello was as loud as the piano. Both instruments melded their tonalities. I could hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing effects, the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the 1100 rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments melded their tonalities, but none sounded veiled in the mix. The cymbals were as loud as the saxophone. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes were a bit louder than what I heard on the Aventone planar. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. The 1100 made each cymbal strike sound the same. Overall, the 1100 appears to have a marginal upper treble emphasis. This is neither harsh nor piercing, even at high volumes. Audio-Technica does not say what the detailability of the 1100 ought to be. My tests indicate that there's no better than average detail on the 1100. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD-800S presents 22 footsteps, the Focal Clear, 18. The Austrian Audio High X65 presents 16 to 17. The X55 presents 16 footsteps. The X15 and X25 BT present 13 to 14. The Hi-Fi Matsundara Aventone Planar Sifka Phoenix and Beyerdynamic DT1990 present 10 to 11. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sitka Robin, and Ultrasound Pro 1480i all provide 8 to 9. The audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8. The M1060C provides 7 footsteps. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7. The Neumann ND-H20 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The 1100is rendered 6 to 7 footsteps. On my scale of detail retrieval, the HD6XX and LCD1 are the average performers. Any headphone that provides more or less detail is judged accordingly. So the ND-H20 would be considered as below average and the hifi Mansundara as above average. Here, based on this scale, I think the 1100 has average detail retrieval. Audio-Technica does not say what the Soundstage is supposed to be for this headphone. My impression is that the 1100 has average Soundstage. The 1100 does not present wide Soundstage, at least not in the typical sense. However, if you come from Beats or Bose headphones, then yes, you could say that the 1100 is wide sounding. But compare it to other audiophile headphones and the experience is different. I have a Soundstage scale. Once again, I use the HD6XX and LCD1 as my average performers. Headphones that have more or less Soundstage than these two are judged accordingly. The audeze Mobius and all Beats headphones have claustrophobic soundstage. The ND-H20 and ATH-M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have average soundstage. The Sifka Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultratone Pro 1480i have average to maybe above average soundstage. The hifi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, Austrian Audio Hi X55 and X65, and LCD2 Classic have above average soundstage. The hifi Mandiva has wide soundstage. The ATH-WS1100is has super wide soundstage. In my opinion, the 1100 has soundstage similar but slightly wider than the HD6XX and LCD1. When you read Audio-Technica's explanation about the sound signature, it's pretty unclear. I mean, they label the headphone as solid bass, giving the impression that they're bass heavy, but then they also say that the sound is accurate. Not exactly compatible statements. The bottom line is that the 1100 is not neutral. No surprise there. But what is a surprise is how non-bassy this solid bass headphone actually is. This is not a thumpy, aggressive bass, not the type that you might get from typical Beats. Neither is the sharp, visceral mid-bass impact that you might hear on something like the audeze LCD XC or ZMF Atticus present on the 1100. The 1100 has a bass emphasis to be sure, but it seems that there's a slight emphasis in sub-bass and a greater emphasis in mid-bass. Clarity in this region is no better than average, which is still leagues better than what Beats offers. The mids are forward. Vocals stand 2 steps ahead of instruments. Despite the bass emphasis, mids still remain reasonably clear. While drums do sound louder than other instruments in a mix, you can still hear the various elements. The treble has a marginal emphasis in the upper end. It is not harsh or piercing. The 1100 has average detail and soundstage. Frankly, I was expecting an aggressive V-shaped signature. That's not what I heard. Instead, I'd say that this is more of a W-shaped signature. It's a balanced sounding headphone, not a head-thumping bassing one. It's important we conduct A/B comparisons of gear. We need to know whether the newest gear in the market is any improvement over stuff we already have. To that end, I compared the 1100 against the HD6XX and AKG K361. I used the stock accessories. I plugged headphones into a passive AB switch. That switch was plugged into my Army ADI2 DAC and Matrix Mini iPro 3. I tried to volume match. I listened to my test playlist. There is a noticeable difference between the 6XX and 1100 in bass response. The 1100 is clearer and has greater separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. Transience is similar, however. The 1100 has more bass emphasis overall. The 6XX has greater bass bleed into the mids. The mids are forward on the 1100 and closer to neutral on the 6XX. The 1100 accentuates vocal sibilance for both male and female artists. The 6XX does not. Separation of mid-centric elements is more noticeable on the 1100. The treble is also different. The 6XX has an upper treble roll-off while the 1100 has a marginal upper treble emphasis. Separation and clarity in this region is more obvious on the 1100. The two headphones exhibit similar detail retrieval and soundstage. The 361 and 1100 appear to have different bass response. The 361 has marginally greater sub-bass in comparison. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is clearer on the 1100. Mid-bass impact seems a little sharper on the 1100. The mids are different. The 1100 has forward mids with vocals that stand 2 steps ahead of instruments. The 361 presents vocals shoulder to shoulder with instruments. The 1100 has a bit more separation in this region. Both headphones emphasize vocal sibilance in similar degrees, but the 361 also pushes vocal grain. The treble is a little different. The 1100 has an emphasis in the upper treble. The 361 has an emphasis starting in the mid-treble. Clarity and separation is a bit more obvious on the 1100. The 1100 has about as much detail as the 361. However, the 1100 always presented the same details a little bit more clearly. The 1100 has wider soundstage than the 361. Comparisons like these help us understand where gear fits in. Here, all 3 headphones have vastly different sound signatures. The 6XX could be characterized as having a dark sound signature among these 3. The 361 would be the bassiest of them, and the 1100 sits somewhere in the middle. Whether any of these headphones would be to your liking is something for you to discover. Audio-Technica is selling the 1100 for a little over $200. You can find this headphone around other retailers for less. But in the present competitive headphone market, you can find lots of alternatives within this price range as well. Truth be told, my assumption when I bought the 1100 was that it was a V-shaped aggressive headphone. I was wrong. It isn't. I thought it would have a muddy, veiled mid-range, and again, I was wrong about that. Surprisingly, the 1100 is not a Beats clone. It presents a relatively clear sound with a noticeable but not bloated bass emphasis. I say relatively because that is the necessary term. If you compare the 1100 to Austrian audio headphones, then it will sound bassy as hell. Compare, however, to the K361 and there's a different perception. Okay, so time for the bottom line. Is the WS1100is value at around $200? That depends on what you're looking for. As I said, you've got lots of options in this price range, but if you're not happy with the K361, K371, or HD6XX because they sound muddy or not clear enough, then the 1100 is definitely a different enough beast. I think this headphone is a bit overpriced. If you find it under $200, then it's probably worth considering, but the MSRP is not a good reflection of what this headphone brings to the market. In my opinion, the 1100 should cost around $150. That's a more fair price. It keeps it in line with the AKG options but also undercuts the 6XX if sold at $150. Then again, you might love the fit and sound of the 1100 and think $200 is a good price. And that is up to you.